My wife fired me on a Monday morning in front of 42 people. She served me divorce papers the following Thursday. I signed both at the same kitchen table on Friday morning. Then I walked to my study, picked up the phone, called my assistant, and said 4 words. Fire every one of them. She asked me which ones. I told her the ones sitting in the 3 board seats I control. My wife had forgotten one thing when she planned all of this. I was the reason she had a board in the first place. If you have ever been removed by someone who had no idea what was holding them up, drop a comment below and hit subscribe, because what Leonard Cross did after that Friday morning at his kitchen table is one of the most precise and patient things you will hear this year. Leonard Cross grew up on Lancaster Avenue in West Philadelphia, in a row house where the front steps were swept every morning without discussion, and the expectation in that house was not that you would become famous or wealthy or recognized, but that you would become useful, genuinely, practically, lastingly useful to whatever you put your hands on. His mother taught 3rd grade at a school 4 blocks away for 31 years. His father ran a small electrical contracting business out of a truck he kept maintained, the way other men kept their best suit, with the understanding that the condition of your tools told the world everything it needed to know about the seriousness of your intentions. Leonard absorbed both of those things and took them into a career that nobody at his high school graduation would have predicted, and nobody who worked with him afterward could imagine being done by anyone else. He became a corporate turnaround specialist, the man companies called when they had run out of easier options and needed someone who could walk into a failing organization, diagnose it without sentiment, and rebuild it into something that could hold its own weight again. He did it 17 times across 35 years and never once appeared in a business publication because the companies that hired him preferred their difficulties stay private, and Leonard preferred the work to the attention. He met Vivian Marsh at a governance conference in Center City, Philadelphia in 2004. Sharp, polished, the kind of operational thinker who could assess a room's power structure within 20 minutes of entering it and position herself accordingly without anyone noticing she was doing it. They married in 2005, and for the first decade, the marriage ran on genuine respect between 2 professionals who understood what serious work required and gave each other room to do it. Leonard's practice took him to failing companies across the Mid-Atlantic, and occasionally further. Vivian built her consulting career steadily through a series of senior roles that sharpened her operational instincts without yet giving her the platform her ambition had always been calibrated for. That platform arrived in 2018, when Meridian Group's board, 4 of whose 5 members Leonard knew personally through 2 decades of Philadelphia business relationships, began looking for a new CEO. Leonard made 3 phone calls. Vivian got the interview. Vivian got the job. He never told her about the calls because he didn't want her first year in the role complicated by gratitude she hadn't asked for. In 2017, a year before Vivian took the Meridian role, Leonard was offered a 2-year turnaround engagement in London, a mid-size financial services firm in serious distress, the kind of complex international work that represented the most challenging and financially significant engagement of his career to that point. The number on the table was $4.2 million over 24 months. He turned it down on a Tuesday phone call, without making it a dinner conversation, because Vivian's Meridian appointment was in its earliest and most critical phase, and his board relationships in Philadelphia needed to remain stable and available during her first year. He told the London firm his timing wasn't right. He never told Vivian the engagement existed. He filed it in the same internal place he filed most things he absorbed on her behalf, without a label, without an expectation of acknowledgement, without a plan to retrieve it later when the accounting finally came due. Between 2018 and 2021, Meridian encountered 2 client situations that had the potential to become public scandals of the kind that end a CEO's tenure in the first years of a promising run. Leonard handled both at the board level before either reached the executive floor in a form that required Vivian's direct involvement. 3 years of private crisis management that kept Meridian's reputation intact and Vivian's position secure, and that appeared nowhere on his employment record because it was handled in the spaces between official functions where the real structural work of keeping an organization sound actually happens. He was Meridian's senior strategy advisor during this period, a role he had proposed to the board when Vivian joined, designed to keep his expertise available internally during the transition. He took a standard advisor's salary, He kept his board relationships entirely separate from his advisory role. He treated the two functions the way a structural engineer treats the foundation and the visible building, understanding that the value of the first is what makes the second possible, and that confusing them helps no one. The Monday morning firing happened in Meridian's main conference room on the 4th floor. 42 members of the senior leadership team were present. Department heads, division directors, the full operational layer of the company assembled for what had been announced as a quarterly strategy session. Vivian stood at the front of the room with the composed authority of a CEO making a business decision and announced a restructuring of the advisory function. She said the senior strategy advisor role was being eliminated. She said Leonard Cross was being released effective immediately. She said it with the same professional finality she brought to every difficult operational announcement, and the same complete absence of the woman who had shared 19 years of a life with the man, sitting in the 4th row, who heard his name called and felt the particular weight of something that had clearly been planned long enough to have lost any hesitation by the time it arrived. Leonard sat with it for about 5 seconds. Then he thanked his colleagues by name, gathered his notebook, and left the building in 9 minutes. He did not make a scene. He did not say anything in that room that the room did not deserve to hear. The divorce papers arrived by courier on Thursday morning at the Chestnut Hill house. Leonard signed them at the kitchen table on Friday morning with the same pen he used for everything, a plain ballpoint, nothing that announced itself, alongside the separation agreement his attorney had already reviewed and marked. He sat at that table for a while after he finished, looking at nothing in particular, letting the weight of a 19-year marriage ending on a Friday morning at a kitchen table find its own level without interference. Then he got up, washed his coffee mug, put the signed documents in a folder for his attorney, walked down the hall to his study, picked up the phone, and called Dara Okonkwo. Dara answered on the second ring the way she always answered. His name, nothing wasted. Leonard said 4 words. He said, "Fire every one of them." Dara did not ask him what he meant by that, because 11 years of working exclusively for Leonard Cross had given her the precise vocabulary required to understand exactly what he meant. She asked him only one question. She asked which seats. And when Leonard told her, the silence on Dara's end of the line lasted about 3 seconds. The silence of a woman who has just understood the full shape of what her employer is about to do and is making sure she has every detail exactly right before she begins. The first thing Leonard did the Monday after the Friday at the kitchen table was call his accountant, his attorney, and his oldest active client, in that order, before 9 in the morning. From the study in the Chestnut Hill house, with a fresh cup of coffee, and the particular focused calm of a man who has spent 35 years walking into broken situations and knows that the first 48 hours of any turnaround are the most important, because that is when the shape of the problem becomes clearest, before the noise of responding to it obscures the diagnosis. His sister Margaret called twice that first week. His college roommate Bernard stopped by on a Saturday with the unspoken intention of simply being present in the same room for a few hours, which was the most useful thing Bernard had done for Leonard in 20 years, and Leonard told him so. The divorce hurt in the way that 19 years of genuine effort hurts when it ends by courier on a Thursday morning. Not with noise, not with collapse, but with the specific gravity of a thing that has been planned against you long enough that its arrival, when it finally comes, carries the weight of all the time that went into preparing it. Leonard sat with that weight the way he sat with every structural problem he had ever been hired to solve. Fully, without flinching, until he understood its complete shape. Then he went to work. The governance agreement was a 14-page document that Leonard's attorney had negotiated on his behalf in 2014, when Meridian was going through a board restructuring that Leonard had been retained to facilitate. The agreement gave Leonard the authority to appoint and replace the occupants of 3 of Meridian's 5 board seats designated as independent governance positions, for as long as he maintained an active professional relationship with the company, defined in the agreement as holding any compensated role, advisory or operational, with Meridian Group or any of its subsidiaries. His firing from the senior strategy advisor role had ended that active professional relationship on a Monday morning in a conference room on the 4th floor. What Vivian's legal team had apparently not stress-tested was the clause that gave Leonard 60 days following the termination of his professional relationship to exercise his final appointment authority over those 3 seats before the governance rights reverted to the full board. Leonard had 30 days remaining. He used 28 of them. The 3 replacements were selected with the same methodical precision Leonard brought to every personnel decision of his professional life. Not people who owed him favors, not people who would do whatever he said, but people whose professional integrity was beyond question, and whose governance expertise was exactly what 3 newly vacated board seats required. Carol Fenn was the first name on the list, 59 years old, a governance specialist with a track record on 4 previous boards that Leonard had observed closely enough across 2 shared turnaround engagements to know that she read organizational documents the way good doctors read test results, completely and without assuming she already knew what they said. The second appointment was a retired federal compliance attorney named Marcus Webb from Princeton, who had spent 28 years doing the kind of regulatory work that made him constitutionally incapable of overlooking something that needed to be reported. The third was a CFO-turned-board director named Patricia Song from Wilmington, whose financial forensics background had saved 2 companies Leonard knew of from compliance disasters that would have ended them. Dara filed the appointment documentation with Meridian's corporate secretary on a Thursday afternoon. Leonard was in his study reviewing a client patent portfolio when his phone showed a call from Vivian's personal number, the first contact she had initiated since the courier on Thursday morning. He let it go to voicemail. He did not listen to the voicemail that day or the day after. Vivian's reaction to the board appointments moved through her legal team first, and then through Meridian's corporate counsel, and then through 2 outside governance attorneys her team retained to find a mechanism to challenge the appointments before they took effect. What all 4 attorneys told her, in slightly different professional language that amounted to the same conclusion, was that the 2014 governance agreement was unambiguous, that Leonard's appointment authority had been exercised within the prescribed window, and that the 3 new board members were legally seated with full governance rights as of the filing date. The appointments stood. The 3 board members Leonard had removed, the same 3 who had voted to approve the advisory restructuring that ended his employment, were replaced. Vivian had a new board majority she had not chosen and could not reverse, and had not seen coming because the governance agreement had been in the Meridian corporate records for 11 years, and nobody on her legal team had apparently read it with the attention it deserved until the moment it mattered. The new board majority convened its first session on a Tuesday morning in the same 4th-floor conference room where Leonard had been fired 6 weeks earlier. Carol Fenn chaired the session because the governance agreement specified that the chair of the independent governance seats rotated to the most senior appointee, which was Carol by professional tenure. The 2 remaining original board members attended with the careful attentiveness of people who understand that the power geometry of a room has changed and are recalibrating their positioning accordingly. Vivian attended as CEO, which she remained, her operational authority intact, and her executive functions unchanged, because Leonard had been precise about this, had instructed his attorney to be precise about this, because the board restructuring was a governance correction, not a personal operation, and the distinction mattered to him regardless of what Vivian had done on a Monday morning 6 weeks prior. Meanwhile, Meridian, without Leonard's informal backstop, was beginning to show the kind of stress that only becomes visible once the thing that was managing it is gone. 2 client relationships that Leonard had been quietly stabilizing through board-level conversations became formally elevated complaints within the first month of his absence. A compliance filing that Leonard had been tracking and nudging toward completion through his advisory role was 3 weeks past its internal deadline. The operational layer of the company was performing adequately. Vivian was a genuine operational talent, and her team was solid, but the structural connective tissue that Leonard had been providing between the board, the governance requirements, and the long-term client relationships was no longer there, and the organization was beginning to feel its absence, in the specific way that buildings feel the absence of load-bearing elements that nobody noticed were load-bearing until they were gone. Carol Fenn called Leonard on a Wednesday evening at 6:47, 3 weeks after her board appointment took effect, and 2 days after she had completed her orientation review of Meridian's full governance documentation. Leonard was at the kitchen table in Chestnut Hill with a site assessment report and a cup of tea that had gone cold. He answered on the second ring. Carol said she needed to talk to him about something she had found during the orientation review, something that had been in the Meridian governance records for 8 months and that the previous board had apparently not been told about. She said she needed him to understand the full picture before she decided how to proceed, because what she had found was not a small thing, and the way it was handled in the next 30 days would determine whether 430 people still had jobs at the end of the year. Leonard set his tea down. He told her to go ahead. Before we get to what Carol found in those governance records, drop a comment below and tell us. When Vivian called Leonard after the board appointments were filed and he let it go to voicemail, do you think she knew at that moment how far this was going to go? Tell us what you think. Because what Carol told Leonard on that Wednesday evening changed everything that happened next. What Carol had found was not buried. That was the first thing Leonard understood when she finished walking him through it on the phone Wednesday evening. It had not been hidden in the way that things are hidden when people know they are doing something wrong and are trying to prevent discovery. It had been managed in the way that things are managed when people convince themselves that management is the same thing as resolution, and that if a problem stays contained long enough, it eventually stops being a problem. 8 months earlier, a Meridian consulting team working with a regional logistics company called Hartwell Distribution had identified financial irregularities in Hartwell's internal accounts. Irregularities that met the regulatory threshold for mandatory disclosure to Hartwell's auditors, and potentially to the relevant federal oversight body. The Meridian team had flagged it internally. The flag had traveled up through 2 senior directors to Vivian's office, and there it had stopped. Not because Vivian had explicitly instructed anyone to bury it. Carol was precise about this, because Carol was always precise, but because the decision had been made at the executive level to continue managing the client relationship while the irregularities were reviewed internally. A review that had now been ongoing for 8 months, without producing a disclosure, without producing a formal finding, and without producing anything except the passage of time during which Meridian's legal exposure had been compounding with the patient indifference of interest on an unpaid debt. Leonard sat at the kitchen table in Chestnut Hill after the call and looked at the cold cup of tea for a long time without touching it. He had handled compliance situations across 35 years of turnaround work, and he understood the complete shape of what Carol had described within about 4 minutes of her finishing the description. The exposure was real. The timeline had made it worse. The 430 people who came to work at Meridian every day and did their jobs correctly and had nothing to do with a decision made 8 months ago in an executive office on the 4th floor were the ones who would absorb the consequences if this surfaced publicly in an uncontrolled way. Through a whistleblower, through a regulatory audit, through Hartwell's own auditors eventually finding what Meridian's team had found and tracing the knowledge back to its source. Leonard had spent his career making decisions about broken organizations by asking one question first: who bears the cost if this goes wrong? And then making sure his decisions protected the people who bore the cost without having caused the problem. The answer in this case was 430 people on 3 floors of a building in Philadelphia who were going about their Wednesday entirely unaware that the ground under the organization was not as solid as the lobby looked. He called Carol back Thursday morning at 7:30 and told her to prepare the disclosure documentation for board review. He told her to retain outside compliance counsel independent of Meridian's existing corporate attorneys, because Meridian's corporate attorneys had been aware of the situation and their independence was compromised, and to have a complete legal assessment of the disclosure pathway on his desk by Monday. Carol said she had already identified 2 firms. Leonard said to retain both and compare their analyses. Then he called his own attorney and spent 45 minutes walking through the board session procedures required under the governance agreement for a vote on executive administrative action. He spent the weekend reviewing Carol's preliminary documentation and Marcus Webb's regulatory analysis, which arrived Saturday afternoon and confirmed what Leonard had already concluded. The disclosure was not optional. The timeline had not improved the situation, and the board had both the authority and the obligation to act before the exposure became public, through a channel nobody in that building controlled. The board session was called for Tuesday at 9. All 5 members attended: Carol, Marcus, Patricia Song on Leonard's side of the governance ledger, and the 2 remaining original board members whose positioning in the room reflected the careful attentiveness of people who had read the compliance documentation over the weekend and understood that the vote they were about to participate in had only one defensible outcome, regardless of their prior loyalties. Vivian attended with her personal attorney and Meridian's CFO, who had not been among the people aware of the Hartwell situation, and whose expression throughout the session carried the specific tension of a senior executive learning in a boardroom something he should have been told 8 months ago. Outside Compliance Counsel presented the full regulatory picture in 40 minutes. The nature of the irregularities, the disclosure threshold, the 8-month timeline, the current legal exposure, and the range of outcomes depending on whether disclosure was initiated by the board proactively or surfaced through an external channel. When the presentation concluded, the room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the correct answer to a question is visible to everyone present, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Vivian's attorney made a measured argument for a structured internal resolution process, a 30-day window for Meridian to initiate disclosure under executive authority with board oversight, rather than through a formal governance action against the CEO. Leonard's side of the table listened to it completely. Then Carol asked one question. She asked whether the same executive authority that had managed the situation for 8 months without producing a disclosure could be trusted to produce one in 30 days. The room did not answer. The answer was already present in the silence. The vote on placing Vivian on administrative leave pending a formal governance review was called at 11:47, 3-2. Carol, Marcus, and Patricia voting in favor. The 2 original board members voting against, with the careful positioning of people protecting a relationship rather than a principle. Vivian received the board's formal notification at noon. Her access to executive systems was suspended at 12:15 by Meridian's IT director, following the board secretary's instruction. She left the building at 12:40 with her attorney and her personal items in a bag her assistant had packed, and she did not say anything to the floor on the way out, because there was nothing to say that her attorney would have approved of saying. 430 people went about their Tuesday on 3 floors of a Philadelphia building, entirely unaware that the governance structure above them had changed in a way that would determine whether those floors were still occupied in 6 months. Leonard had been precise about this. The administrative leave was handled through HR with language that cited an ongoing governance review, professional, factual, and entirely free of the kind of detail that produces speculation and instability on a company floor. The compliance disclosure to Hartwell's auditors was filed by outside counsel on Wednesday morning. The regulatory notification followed Thursday. Meridian's public statement, drafted by Carol and reviewed by 3 attorneys, was 4 sentences long and said exactly what needed to be said without a single word that invited a follow-up question. The Hartwell situation would cost Meridian a client relationship and a significant legal fee and approximately 8 months of careful reputation management. What it would not cost was 430 jobs, because the difference between a problem disclosed and a problem discovered is the difference between a company that survives a difficult year and a company that does not survive at all. The new board majority met informally the following Monday morning in Carol's temporary office on the 4th floor. The same floor, a different room, the particular atmosphere of 3 people who have just done a hard thing correctly and are now facing the next hard thing that comes immediately after. Carol looked at Leonard across the table with the direct professional regard of a woman who has worked alongside enough capable people to know one when she has just watched him operate under pressure. She said the board needed to name an interim CEO within 2 weeks to stabilize the organization and begin the formal search for a permanent appointment. She said the board's preference, if Leonard was willing, was to hear his recommendation. Marcus nodded. Patricia nodded. And Leonard looked at the 3 people sitting across from him. 3 people he had chosen precisely because they would do exactly what they had just done, and understood that the last decision of his involvement with Meridian was the most important one, and that he had known the answer to it since before Carol had ever called him on a Wednesday evening with what she found. Leonard named Dara Okonkwo. He said her name across the table in Carol's temporary office on the 4th floor, the same way he said everything that mattered. Once, without preamble, with the complete confidence of a man who has already done the analysis and is now simply reporting the conclusion. Carol looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating an assumption they hadn't realized they were making. Marcus Webb leaned back slightly in his chair. Patricia Song set her pen down. Leonard gave them 3 minutes of reasons, not because the case required 3 minutes, but because a board deserved to understand the full shape of a recommendation before they voted on it. 11 years as his assistant, 4 years before that as a senior operations coordinator at a consulting firm in Center City, where she had managed a team of 22 and turned around the firm's client retention rate in 18 months without a title change or a budget increase. An instinctive understanding of organizational structure that most people with MBAs from expensive schools spent their careers trying to develop and never quite reached. The board voted 3-2, the same margin as Tuesday, the same 3, the same 2, the same principle on both sides of it. Dara Okonkwo was named interim CEO of Meridian Group, effective the following Monday. Leonard called her from the parking garage before he left the building. She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be genuine. Then she said she understood what he was asking her to do. He said he knew. He said that was why he asked her. Meridian stabilized in the way that organizations stabilize when the right person is placed at the operational center of them and given the authority to do what they already know how to do without interference. Dara moved through the company's 3 floors in her first week, the way Leonard had always moved through the first week of a turnaround, not announcing herself, not restructuring anything, just listening to the organization the way a doctor listens to a chest before deciding what the problem actually is, rather than what it looks like from the outside. She met with every department head individually. She read every active client file. She identified 3 operational gaps that had been present before the governance crisis and would have become significant problems within the next 2 quarters, regardless of what had happened on the 4th floor. She addressed all 3 within her first 30 days in language that her teams understood and with resources she reallocated rather than requested, because Dara Okonkwo had spent 11 years watching Leonard Cross turn around broken organizations and had learned, by proximity and by attention, that the most effective interventions are almost always the ones that cost the least and understand the most. The Hartwell compliance disclosure worked its way through the regulatory process with the careful management of outside counsel and produced exactly the outcome Leonard had calculated, a significant but survivable consequence for a company that had disclosed proactively and cooperated completely. The 430 people on 3 floors of that building kept their jobs. Most of them never knew how close the margin had been. Leonard's formal involvement with Meridian ended on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Dara's appointment, when he signed the final documentation terminating his governance authority over the 3 board seats, a transfer of appointment rights to the board itself, structured so that the seats would be filled by independent governance process going forward, rather than remaining tied to any individual. He signed it at his attorney's office on Walnut Street, shook hands, walked out into the Philadelphia afternoon, and felt the particular lightness of a man who has put down something heavy that he has been carrying long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight of it. He did not drive directly home. He sat in his car for a moment in the parking garage on Sansom Street and looked at nothing in particular and let the ending of it find its own level, the same way he had let the beginning of it find its level at the kitchen table in Chestnut Hill on a Friday morning 11 weeks earlier. Vivian called on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after her exit from Meridian. Not through her attorney, not through a formal channel, just her number on his phone at 7:20 in the evening, the way it had appeared on his phone for 19 years, when she was calling from wherever she was to wherever he was. He answered because some calls need to be answered not for the sake of the person calling, but for the sake of the person you are choosing to be when you pick up. She said his name. He said, "Hello, Vivian." What followed was the most honest conversation they had managed in 5 years, and it was honest in the way that conversations become honest, when everything that was protecting both people from the full truth has already been removed by events neither of them controlled. She said she had not known about the Hartwell situation when it started. She had been told it was being managed and had accepted that framing without pressing hard enough on what managed actually meant in practice. Leonard said he believed her. She said the board appointments were something she had not anticipated. He said he knew. She asked him one question. She asked whether he had done it for the company or for himself. Leonard thought about it honestly before he answered, the way he always thought about things that deserved an honest answer. He said he had done it for 430 people who came to work every day and had nothing to do with what happened between the 2 of them, and that if it had also been the correct response to a Monday morning in a conference room, then he was willing to accept that both things could be true at the same time, without either of them canceling the other out. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said that sounded like him. He said he knew. He told her he hoped she found her footing. He meant it without condition. The call ended at 7:51, and Leonard sat in the study in the Chestnut Hill house, with the phone on the desk in front of him, and the Philadelphia evening going dark outside the window, and felt the last unresolved thing between them settle into something that no longer required his attention. He drove the long way home that night. Not from Chestnut Hill, he was already there, but from a late dinner with Bernard in Rittenhouse Square, taking the route that went west across the Schuylkill on South Street, and up through the neighborhoods toward Lancaster Avenue the way he used to be. Drive it when he was 28 and had just finished his first turnaround and was driving home to his apartment in West Philly with the windows down and the specific feeling of a man who has just done something difficult correctly for the first time and doesn't yet know it won't be the last. That first turnaround had been a small manufacturing company in Kensington. 41 employees, 3 months of work, a Friday afternoon when Leonard had stood in the parking lot and watched the lights stay on in the building and understood for the first time what this work was actually for. Not the fee, not the outcome on paper, the lights staying on. The people inside them going home to their families with paychecks that cleared. He had carried that Friday afternoon in Kensington with him through 17 turnarounds across 35 years, the way his father had carried the understanding of his electrical work. Not as a trophy, just as the knowledge of what the work was, for when everything else about it got complicated. Lancaster Avenue in West Philadelphia, on a Thursday evening in late spring, does not ask anything of the person driving through it. The row houses sit the way they have always sat, close together, front steps swept or not swept, the particular density of a neighborhood that was built for people who needed to be near each other and never stopped being that regardless of what happened to the city around it. Leonard drove the length of it slowly with the window down and the evening air coming through warm, and the smell of someone's dinner from an open window 2 blocks in, and the sound of children on a stoop that he passed, without slowing, because the stoop was full, and the evening was good, and Lancaster Avenue was doing what it had always done, without requiring his observation to do it correctly. He drove past the block where the row house had been. His parents' house, swept front steps, thin windows, loud furnace, and did not stop, because stopping was not the point. The point was the driving through, the returning, the understanding that the place you came from is not diminished by everything that happened between leaving it and coming back. He turned north toward Chestnut Hill and drove home through the Philadelphia evening with 35 years of fixed things behind him and nothing left ahead that needed fixing, and the particular piece of a man who has finally, completely, put his tools down. If Leonard's story stayed with you tonight, if you have ever held something together for people who did not know you were holding it and kept going anyway, hit subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. Every week, we bring you stories about people who did the work correctly when it would have been easier not to. You stayed with this one all the way to Lancaster Avenue. That means you understand exactly what this channel is for. Do not miss what we bring you next week.